All right. Hi, fellas. My name's Lily. Welcome to my new podcast. Today, we're diving into neurochemistry, autism, and performance with someone who you're bound to find extremely interesting, unique, and knowledgeable. With that, I'm so excited to introduce Andrew Triana, the founder of Go Super Brain, and someone with a wonderfully immersive knowledge base that I'm very, very excited to get into. So I'll let him further introduce himself if there's anything else he wants to add.
No, I'm Andy. I'm kind of hard to find sometimes, but that's by design, and I enjoy it that way.
Yeah. All right. So firstly, I want to just start with kind of contemplation of intelligence. Like, what is intelligence to you?
Great question. And Jensen Huang, I believe I'm saying his last name correct, the CEO of NVIDIA was asked somewhat of a similar question not long ago on a well-recognized interview. And his ultimate answer was someone being able to analyze data and see around a corner, if you will, make a decision into the near future and include like a humanistic aspect to that decision. I think he's pretty spot on there. And I think it's something that does change over time because intellect is only relative to accessibility, right?
Hmm.
So, for example, if we look at, some incredible minds early in human history, Socrates, Galileo, et cetera, all these types of people. You could call them far more intellectually advanced than their peers because they were kind of doing it based on nothing. And
Hmm.
peers is maybe an overzealous word to use. They were kind of all by themselves, right? So I
Yes.
think intellect back then was a little more like factual. Whereas today, accessibility to knowledge, facts, and resources, literally like podcasts, is
Yeah.
somewhat ubiquitous. So I think intellect nowadays exists at the intersection of the application of the knowledge
Mm,
and how you apply it to the world that you're participating in, right? Because we could talk about like a one of one scenario that may only occur 1 out of 20 times in like a service based like
yeah.
environment, right? But if there's someone that can apply even maybe a little less knowledge than their counterpart, but to maybe 17 to 19 out of those 20 scenarios, I'd probably call them a little more intellectual than the counterpart in that scenario.
I see. I see. So do you look at it at all with the, I guess, different components of G as is quantified scientifically, like in terms of processing speed, in terms of like fluid intelligence? Is that something you ever think about or use on a practical level in terms of cognitive enhancement or improving those individual aspects of IQ?
Yeah, well said. I think there's criterion, right? That's like asking any athlete if a generalized cardiovascular system is useful, right? So I think if you're struggling to learn, then you need to look at those basic metrics first, right? Like
Mm,
people who are good at this stuff, where are they at, right? And then once you meet some of those criterion metrics, I think, for example, I think attention span is one that's incredibly overlooked, right?
mm.
Especially because processing speed is sexy, it feels good with
Yeah.
the right supplements. But that's like looking at, for example, longevity, I believe it's a long-term game, right? Your goal is to be area under the curve for as long as possible. You can't make enough change in 1 week to significantly impact longevity, right? For the
Yeah.
most part.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like that. Your goal, once you've met criteria and metrics of intelligence, is to be able to stay there and individualize your development cognitively over time from there.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating perspective. Very interesting. So, would you say that there's in terms of IQ improving from like a neurological health aspect as like some of those components can be degraded with poor health. Do you view IQ as more of a ceiling of what maximally could be achieved, or since it's loaded on G very heavily, you know what I mean? It's yeah.
I think IQ is and just intelligence as a criterion or quantitative value in general, I think just sets us up for like how calories sets you up ideally for food. Is it
Okay.
super hard as a number? Maybe not, but if you're drastically off, then it is helpful, right? So
Yeah.
like, let's say you maybe took an IQ test and you were at an IQ of 96 and you applied to be, chief of staff at a hospital. Not in any degrading way. You might not be in the right ballpark, or at least just yet. No, like you said,
Mhm.
plastic to a large degree, right? So you might
Yeah.
not be there just yet. And in the same vein, let's say you do an IQ test and you're like at a 126 arbitrarily, like whatever that means, right? And
Mhm.
then you go and do something and find yourself bored or isolated. That can also make sense because they've shown that people with IQ scores above 120 actually have a beginning at 120, a slope downwards in social functioning and connectedness, you know?
Yes.
So I think it's like a ballpark number, like I said, like calories. Like, do I feel isolated from my friends? Yes or no? Do I see my friends enough? Or is there a large IQ disparity and is there a values disparity? Yes, yes, and yes. It's like, okay, well, you're not crazy. In fact, you're probably just using the equation incorrectly, if you will.
Very fascinating. Wow. So there are constraints that can reduce like the expression of what might be considered intelligence.
Hmm. And
Awesome.
not just that, I believe it's fluid. I believe it's largely individual. So I tell people it's like
Mm.
the difference between making progress and putting out fires. Like, let's say you're struggling with brain fog and you've gone through several bouts of antibiotics and your stomach's ruined and all that stuff.
Mhm.
In essence, you might not actually have brain fog. You might just have extreme digestion related ailments that might also mess with your vagus nerve. And now you have brain fog, right? It's like the
Yeah.
difference
Yeah.
between, imagine you're cutting weight, do a hot bath, get up, and you're like woozy from it. And then you're like, oh, I must have POTS or an orthostatic hypotension issue. It's like, no, you were just cutting weight in a hot tub and you got up really fast.
Yeah.
Right. And I think
Yeah.
that's the discernment.
Yeah. Okay, that was very, very valuable and really made things click.
Mhm.
But very interesting. Have you found a link between, I guess, autonomic state, like eh, heart rate variability, like recovery metrics, and cognitive performance, or is that a good gauge as it is with like physical performance?
I don't think it's as strong as physical performance. No, it's a good question. I think it's much more aligned with the task you're doing. So let's say you're
Mm.
doing like a lot of multitasking, emails, things that probably you won't benefit from being extra thoughtful about. Then you might want to lean on maybe being slightly sympathetic and maybe cranking processing speeds up.
Okay.
Whereas now, let's say you're doing like a business outline or you're thinking philosophically or even long term or mulling over a complex decision, you might actually be better off being parasympathetic and a slower processing speed with a longer attention span and with a longer, detail oriented approach to the problem. So I think looking at that, I've seen that quite often in my consults I run personally, although I don't do a
Hmm.
ton of them anymore. People are like, Andy, I was looking at a long term outline for an athlete and I took 300 milligrams of caffeine, bromantane, lion's mane, saffron, and some nootropics. And I couldn't figure out why I was stressed and couldn't figure out why it didn't come out like a good outline. And it's like, because not everything's a hammer, right?
Yeah.
Like, once you have decent processing speed, going faster is not always better, right?
100% agree.
Same with
Yeah.
reaction time in sports. Like, I think you mentioned that you do combat sports, right?
Hmm.
Reaction time at a certain point will be worse because you're going to be hyper responsive.
Hmm.
You need to be
Flinch at
just
everything.
Yes, exactly. You need to
Hmm.
be just reactive enough to be reactive, but if you're hyper responsive, someone's gonna feint you or fake or whatever, and you're gonna
Hmm.
bite, and now you're in a whole nother scenario.
Yeah, dip right into it. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Oh, that was such a great example there. And very interesting thing about, like, I see that with myself in terms of being like more parasympathetic and looking at my recovery metrics and realizing the days that I'm more philosophical or the days I'm more like a hammer, like nailing things out, doing things versus contemplating, drawing ideas together. That's when I'm in a more parasympathetic state and I meaningfully try to be. So that's very valuable to point out.
Whether
But
we look at it from a cortical activation standpoint or just a behavior one, I think it makes sense in either way.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of want to draw this back to like general pop. So, what would you say the largest bottleneck for cognitive performance in the general population is? Like, because I know a lot of Americans, they wake up, they drink their caffeine, and they're completely dependent on it. Everything else is kind of depleted. It's like this, like, pseudo nootropic, just trying to get through the day. Like, what do you think their biggest bottleneck is?
The biggest bottleneck is actually like a lack of decision making in my mind. Like I said, they
Mm,
just assume that this is going to be the best choice. So they don't look at what they're doing and be like, huh, what's the best behavioral strategy? Or, for example, caffeine, compared to other stimulants, it's a relatively long half life,
hmm
right? So maybe you only have 90 minutes to 2 hours of truly important work to get done in a given scenario, and you took a drug with a 5 hour half life. So it's like also like, that might not just be the best ROI either. And I think that's their bottleneck. It's like you're
I
choosing
see.
things that are either not efficient or the wrong tool for the right job, then you're gritting through it anyway. You don't, like, have to suffer, to do things.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And I've heard you describe caffeine as kind of like posing the question, like, do you want to run around? I'm paraphrasing, but do you want to run around like a kid and like have energy like a kid? Or do you want to be able to sink into things and focus? And that kind of reframed like how I would think about that, catecholamine slosh that is
Mhm.
caffeine, but and a I don't know, it's a just a pattern
No,
integrated into
totally, and
routines.
it's easy to fall into them, but I think it's just like, if you're loyal to making progress, you need to ask yourself these questions, and I think that's, like, the really important part for people to kinda see in themselves, right? It's like, if you're when we take caffeine or even just get hyped up in general, we become less hesitant, and we ask less questions and make more
Mhm.
assumptions.
True, true.
Right? So, like, what I just said
Yeah.
about fighting, is that a good thing or a bad thing, and where do I draw the line, right? So when you're mulling things over slowly, the first thing you wanna do is be hesitant and ask questions, not the last, and that's where I see the 2 biggest things I'd say that kill people's businesses and productivity are improper timelines and impulsivity.
Mm,
You need to know the realistic timeline to get this done, and then you need to know when to go pins down and when to pull the pins back.
mm. Absolutely, absolutely. So in regards to burnout, and I kinda wanna address this in, like, 2 areas, like, general cognitive burnout where people get burnt out with their life, burnt out with their job, and that kinda stuff, and then, like, actually from an athletic standpoint, like, athletes burnout. Would you say it's, like, more neurochemical, endocrine, or is it literally mindset, or just a variety of them?
I mean, there's no absolutes, right? But I would bias the life burnout on the mindset phenomenology sides of things. It's more your perception of the reality you're living oftentimes. And it's not always in like just perceptual means. Sometimes, like you said, I wake up, I take caffeine every day, and I just do this stuff. It's like, have you ever asked
Yeah.
yourself why? Like,
Yeah, yeah, why am I doing
why are
this?
you
What's my
doing that?
life's mission?
Yes, like, have you ever asked yourself why? And have you ever been like, I take caffeine to not enrich myself, right? Sometimes people
Mhm,
get caffeinated just to not be mindful and, like, wanna go for a walk and eat a meal and not realize how that's actually a disservice to themselves. Like, when you just
mhm,
stim the hell out of yourself, whatever your drug of choice is, all week and never come up for air and then barely recover on the weekend, that's that type of burnout you're talking about. It's like,
mm,
well, you're just not taking care of the human being. When I talk to athletes, I always remind them it's you, your name, and a human being that gets your hand raised when you win. It's not a lactate dehydrogenase score. It's not your
mhm,
success in practice. It's not anything else. Like a human being wins something, right? And I think
yeah,
that's the big mistake people make in their regular day to day lives. And then when we talk about athletes, I do think it's more whether it be neurochemical or specific cortical areas then becoming out of alignment, whether it's electrically or via hemodynamics. So, for example, golf is a really, really technique oriented sport, and some of the best golfers might be hitting 300 and 700 repetitions a day of
wow.
their skill practice. So you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
obviously cholinergically and from a motor neuron and motor unit aspect of very specific fibers get like weirdly trashed, right? Even though
mhm.
you might feel fine otherwise, and that I believe is more biological, if you will.
I see. Would you say that there's biological caps on that, or what do you typically do for those athletes?
I think it's a big question of where are you pushing it relative to what you're capable of and for how
Mm,
long. For
okay.
example, I love all sports, so I'll talk to anybody in sports, right? When people assimilate to combat sports, the first thing they have to get over is like literally just getting hit, swelling up, not having all my bones are like weirdly out of place because I just get beat up now. I got
Yeah.
punched in the face once, and after one punch, I swelled up. Whereas the experienced combat athlete, you can get punched in the face a bunch of times and like it's like a micro swelling, maybe, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that's the important thing to understand. We can sometimes do things we aren't capable of, right? It's the whole point of supplements. So if you're doing something more than you're capable of, I kind of also categorize that as like a different type of burnout, if you will,
Mm,
than if
okay.
you are doing nearly what you're capable of often for a long time,
Okay.
right? Like if it's you just did too much once or for a week, we can just, food, sleep, and a couple breath practices can take care of that, right?
Okay. Okay.
The problem being when we ride out like, 80 to 90% of what you're capable of for like months on end, now we're talking about a totally different phenomenon. Now we might be talking about glutamate toxicity. Now we might be talking about like altered diurnal rhythms of cortisol potentially. Because don't forget, athletes almost always perform at prime time, right? If you're good at something, I learned this later in my career. It's funny, the better you are at something, the shittier of a position you are in to sometimes perform. It's like, think about like a heavyweight combat athlete, or fight of the night, right? You're the last one fighting, not the first one. It's kind
Yeah.
of funny,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It
If
is very
you're
funny.
in the NFL, right? And your Monday night or Thursday night game of the week. It's like you're kicking off at 7 p.m. to play a 3 or 4 hour game.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny how that is. NBA's
Mm-hmm.
crazy late. You might play at like
Yeah.
9 o'clock,
And
you
I mean, in the
know?
martial arts world, like almost all of our practices are at night, and they run till like 9:30. Like there's no way around it.
Or like the crazy people that show up at 4 a.m. Not that there's anything
Yeah.
wrong with that, but like, totally right. Like those are like the two prime time spots for martial arts and combat
Hmm.
stuff as well.
Yes. Yes.
So
Absolutely.
athletes have more than just the weight of the world on their shoulders. Like when you're a general person, just like survive your reality, move that little micro world of your own forward, and you're kind of
Hmm.
good.
Yeah.
Where athletes have true chemical inhibition going on.
Yeah, and it's so multifactorial. Like these things are so complex, and I know that I'm probably asking fairly broad, vague questions, but you're
No,
doing a
you're
great
good.
job at like really like nailing exactly what I'm trying to ask. So it's awesome. But yeah, I have kind of to like pivot to supplementation and neurochemistry. I've been really interested in like GABA modulation as of recently, and I'm really interested in for what groups do you think that any modulation of GABA is useful? I know that there's kind of like a U-shaped curve of direct GABA supplementation, um, or in terms of like, GABA modulators and stuff like that. Like, what are your thoughts and their applicability and usage?
I think there's always like the individual question and the overall mechanism of action question, right?
Mhm.
So I think in that category, kratom's probably the most popular, right? So
Mhm.
kratom's cool because like instant increase in blood pressure, minimal change in heart rate, and you get like that kind of biased, usually sympathetic effect related to it, which is great, especially because like there are scenarios where you want your blood pressure up
Mhm.
versus not, right? It's probably helpful for short bout sports like combat to have a relatively
Mm.
higher blood pressure and an
Mhm.
insane work capacity than a medium work capacity and a low blood pressure, right? Because
Yeah,
there's different ways we
absolutely.
can look at cardiovascular engagement, right? So, like,
Yeah.
let's say you're performing at nighttime and it's like, damn, I'm not going to take caffeine at 8 p.m. That just feels dumb,
Mhm.
right? Kratom's in and out quick, works really fast, and kind of fits that bill there, right?
Interesting.
So,
So you
you
would
know,
think about using kratom for combat. I've never thought about that. I've like used it with people as an alternative to alcohol for those who still kind of want the lower social inhibitions, like a little bit of stimulation, but I never, especially at little higher dosages, and obviously using an extract because there's so many
mhm.
variables.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but that's super fascinating.
Right?
But
Or maybe like a sprinting type thing or like
mm,
extreme phosphagen or creatine focused work, right? Where you don't want an increased cardiovascular response late or after, but you do need a little something now. You know,
yeah.
I think that's where it comes into play. The only weird thing with GABA is that it kind of works a little differently, seemingly in everybody. Like,
That's what
for
I've
example,
noticed. That's why I was
yes,
curious.
that's what's interesting about it. Because funny, I just had a newborn, so it's a little bit on my mind. And we're in the womb. Our primary differentiator neurologically is actually GABA for like
Really?
proliferation and exchange and change neurologically. But the second
Really?
you go through the birthing process, it becomes oxytocin. So the body
Okay.
has this weird relationship with GABA where it changes from the womb to really being a real human, if you will, out of the womb,
Yeah.
obviously, and all that stuff. And then as an adult, it changes even a little more because most neurotransmission is less about secreting a neurotransmitter and more about positively or negatively feedback inhibiting it or facilitating it, right? Trying to get the most out of it, like, similar to the reuptake concept, right? I secrete X number of choline. Instead of making a brand new acetylcholine, I can just do some stuff to it and kind of reuse it, right?
Mhm.
Same thing as cars, right? You can get a brand new car on a lease, you give it back to them, they're going to pretend that never happened and just sell it as a pre-owned vehicle, and they're making double the money off one vehicle somehow, right? So
Mhm.
GABA gets weird in that it touches so many things. For some people, it's truly a better response all around than classical stimulants. Some people may
Interesting.
have altered decision making and that it makes them either aggressive or passive, which may or may not be helpful for what you're doing, kind
Are
of
there
like what we
specific
elucidated.
Sorry,
Yeah.
no, I don't mean to interrupt, but are
No,
there
you're good.
specific phenotypes that you kinda see, like, in responses to GABA?
Yeah, it's pretty quick. Like right away, I'm the aggressive, bad decision one. Like I find in sport scenarios, kratom makes me like everyone thinks that hesitation's bad.
Mhm.
Obviously, nervous and indecision is bad, but hesitation itself is not always bad, right? Like, if someone's pressing into you in combat sports, you're almost better off waiting a picosecond or two
Mhm.
to let them press even harder
Let
than
your
you are, I guess,
phosphocreatine stores
yeah,
regenerate.
then you are immediately responding, correct?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it, right? Looking at the individual difference, whereas some people it makes them happy and jubilant and all the above. So I think it's hard to identify a chemical phenotype, but I think it's easy to identify the archetype psychologically for it. Just like
Archetype,
take it
yeah.
once, look at some biometrics and see how you acted. And I
Mm.
think using whether it be our warm-ups or little like games is a great way to identify how it improves or impedes behavior, right? So whether it's darts, a visual motor task, or like a warm up that you do the same every time, as an
Mm.
athlete or person, you kind of have like this cadence for how it normally goes, right? Like
Mhm.
if you're in combat sports, it might be a sequence that's super easy and comfortable.
Yeah.
In lifting, it's like the classic load you hit on deadlifts before you go heavy. And we develop relationships with them, right?
Mhm.
So you're like, oh wow, like normally that sequence feels like a 1 or 2 beat tap, and that was just way faster, and I don't want that faster, or maybe,
Yeah,
"Oh,
yeah,
shit."
that was not
And you're like
efficient, that was not
yeah,
effective.
and you're like,
Yeah.
"Wow, that got me where I wanted." I also see this a lot in track and field. Track
Mm.
and field is super, super superstitious for these things. Like, elite hurdlers are either consciously or subconsciously counting their steps and rhythmically approaching the
Really?
hurdles. They're not
Whoa.
just, like, jumping over it like they're jumping over things like they're little kids.
Whoa, so it doesn't become necessarily passive. It's this hyper contemplative and awareness, not necessarily this passivity that this flow state passivity that some people describe, which is really interesting.
Yeah, the motor cortex is really good at going through recruitment and refinement cycles and being incredibly responsive to afferent efferent signals. So the best athletes, even if they don't have the words to be able to describe it, know to the smallest minutia exactly how they want something to feel. And that's a lot of times why they get labeled as prima donnas because they're like, "Oh, you're already so good. Why does it matter if it's off a little bit?" But then when you have a little empathy and give them the benefit of the doubt, imagine you had a motor pattern that was incredibly discernible to like the 3 newtons. degree where
Yeah.
it's like, "Oh, man, I'm off by 3 newtons. This isn't the right motor pattern," right? Like, the same way you
Wow.
freak out about, like, taking the wrong turn on the way to work one day and you're gonna be late, that's how
Yeah.
some elite athletes feel about their technique being a little off, and it's very real to them.
Wow, that was a fantastic way to describe it too, because I don't think people understand like the complexity and awareness that these athletes are able to generate at such a high level because most of us will never experience that in our own lives. It's just
Mhm.
so incredible. In that, I'm also interested in terms of like mitochondrial peptides. Like, what do you utilize with athletes, and what's your rationale for stacking them?
I think it's really easy to, especially with a categorical title, which I don't think is incorrect, like mitochondrial peptides. It's easy to just, to quote Mark Bell, just use baby talk, right? It's a
Yeah,
mitochondrial thing and increases endurance or some shit like that. Like,
yeah,
to
yeah.
do it, and I think there's a difference here, right? Like, let's just draw our first line in the sand. Are you worried about your mitochondria performing during exercise? Or are you worried about your mitochondria restoring cellular environments after exercise? They're quite different.
Mm,
There's a lot of people
mhm.
who don't realize where this bleeds into real life. They're like, man, like only when I train and eat more food do I ever lean out, lose weight, or look good or feel better. The second I take a day off of working out, my body doesn't work the same. I can't handle the same amount of food. And maybe like I always gain weight even though I'm eating less food on a non-training day. That's not like a muscle endurance, mitochondria approximating to intramyocellular lipid droplets during exercise problem. That's a mitochondrial maintenance of cellular integrity during rest problem,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah.
They're two totally
Yeah.
different jobs. And I
Yeah.
think that's the way we need to approach it first off. Like,
Mm.
can you not get what you want out of it because your AMPK ceiling is super low, like metabolic syndrome or sedentary lifestyle? The reason
Mhm.
it's hard to get out of it is because within 8 minutes of exercising, they're already going through dysfunctional exphys. Right? That's why
Mm.
they can't lose weight. It's not because it's not discipline or whatever. It's that they don't have. Imagine if someone's like, "Hey, Lily, I'm going to give you all this money to build me a house," and you're like, I don't know where to get wood and like, or use a hammer, like, or any of
Yeah, yeah,
we can
yeah,
give all the profit in the world. I don't have the tools to do that. We can
yeah.
give and that's why it's considered a disease, right? We can give
Mhm.
someone with metabolic syndrome, obesity, or just call it 30 years of sedentary lifestyle. We could give them meth and they wouldn't have the same oxidative phosphorylation response that an athlete would have in regular life, right? We
Wow.
can't supplement outside of what we can't do, right? You can't do
Yeah.
something. It's a miracle we can even adapt to things, right? Because it's like you
Yeah.
can train yourself to do something you've never done before. So if you don't even have, again, like an AMPK related ceiling to get your ATP turnover high in the first place, I mean, you're never going to get there. Like I said, metabolic syndrome. Whereas if you're the opposite, if you're like the type of athlete I talked about where it's like, man, if I don't do physical activity, my biology just sucks, it's almost the opposite of AMPK. It's that in a parasympathetic environment, in a cellular restoring post damage, immune centric environment, you're actually quite poor, And I think that's the easiest way to view the difference between like an SS31 and MOTS-c, which are both super popular right now.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it's one is incredibly different from the other, even though there are certain things that might look the same. I feel like that's why I'm such an ex-phys person. Like glucose oxidation and fatty acid oxidation are not glycolysis and beta oxidation. They're distinctly different terms, right? The substrate
Mhm.
oxidation does not necessarily reference a local environment. The fact that we are
Mm.
compensating by not being able to meet ATP demands or anything like that. That's just simple energy turnover. Something becomes
Yeah.
glycolysis when we're unable to meet demands, when it's a local area that's involved, and it's specific, acute to a stressor. Whereas, like I said, glucose and fatty acid oxidation can occur at any time, can be in a surplus or an equal one-to-one environment of ATP recycling and all that other stuff. They're kind of different. And
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
why it's an important discernment to make.
Wow. Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. because they're becoming oh so popular, and I think people are really not thinking about the mechanism when they're trying to utilize them to achieve their certain goals. And I think, I don't know, I just see very high doses of MOTS-c without like actual lifestyle interventions and stuff like that, and then people not getting the adaptations that they want. But it's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, no, it's totally
So
the Wild West, and I think people are
yeah.
failing to see it. This is a cycle. This was literally getting over-the-counter pro hormones and Superdrol in the 90s, right? If you
Mm.
think about it, the same exact things
Yeah.
happening now with peptides. It's like,
Yeah.
what happened back then? People are like, "Bro, did you hear, like, supplements are pretty cool?" And it's like, "No, I didn't
Yeah.
hear that." And it's like, "Go to Gaspari, buy this crazy stuff. You'll change overnight." Right? And you're, "Oh my god, that happened."
And it's
Right?
all
And then
forum based too. Like this
yes,
is all
exactly.
anecdotal,
Well said.
forum
Great note.
based.
Then
Yeah.
what happened
Yeah.
shortly after? Someone raised their hand and they're like, "Hey, does anybody else have extreme dysfunction problems and all this stuff from all those supplements?" And people were like, "Yeah."
I got
And then
that
and then
too.
well, what's cool is what happened after that, because obviously I'm an optimist. Immediately after that, we had the early 2000s and early 2010s when people were incredibly informed. We had some incredible products on the market, and price to consumer need ratio was actually fair. Right? Now
Mm.
another 15 years go by, and now we're in the peptides where price
Yeah.
to consumer ratio are unfair,
Mhm.
and all the stuff. But it's just the 90s all over again, you know?
Mm. Wow, I've never heard someone convey it like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like a new unprecedented world, like gray market peptides, but it's a wonderful comparison. We're gonna run through all of these anecdotes. Some people are gonna understand the mechanism and try to apply them in a variety of different ways, and then like general pop is gonna start to, I mean, with GLPs, that kind of like
Mhm.
streamlined that one aspect of like general pop using GLPs, which kind of desensitized everyone from, oh, I'm injecting myself with this peptide. But then it's like difference between the gray area. But then people developing like the superficial knowledge of like, then I'm gonna take MOTS-c to do this, and then I'm gonna take GHK to do this and this and this, and like I think it'll just, like he said, it just takes time, but
Mhm.
in the end, there's like the optimistic understanding of like, hey, these compounds that were all inadequate pharmaceutical products that couldn't be patented for a variety of reasons or failed, like they either couldn't be patented, they have to patent the delivery system, etc., didn't have like a market value. Now we have all of these like really interesting compounds that we can use for ourselves, and that's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's not a
It's
bad thing. It's just, like, using it properly. Again, if we replace
yeah.
those 3 peptides you just talked about with the ECA stack, Superdrol, 11-oxo, it's the exact same thing as the 90s. "Hey, dude, you wanna get shredded? Go take Epistane and an ECA stack," right? And it's the same thing, you know?
Yeah.
It is, again, all those, like, I think if you're in a certain scenario, there even may be a use for oral steroids and pro hormones as a
Yeah.
standalone, right? Like, there's always a use for something crazy, but I think we have to get over the exciting new kids with tools and
Yes.
just slowly move towards how do we use these properly, right?
Yeah.
We see a lot of peptide people using the GLP-1 approach. What do I do after I take this? Oh, no, 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 just switch to this one. It's like, okay, cool. And then what do I
You
do
don't have
after
the
that? Do another
habitual,
one.
like,
Yes.
development or changes, like, you just have
Yeah,
that
the
appetite
point's
suppression.
always adaptation, right? Like,
Mhm.
I took MOTS-c for X reasoning. By solving X problem, I no longer need to take MOTS-c, and I don't
Mm,
need to take something else after that,
mhm,
right?
mhm. Yeah, yeah, and I think that, like, with time, we'll start to understand, like, the different synergistic compounds that we can use and how I can like really program these effectively. And, just like with, proper steroid cycles and learning like where should estrogen be? Where should this be? Where should this be? Like over time, anecdote really did carry. It really, really did, because the lack of clinical evidence we have are so slim. It's just a bunch of people experimenting over many, many, many years and different coaches really understanding. Like it's a really beautiful thing to be able to apply science, and even scientists don't get to do that, which is
Yeah, no, of
crazy.
course, yeah. My
So
only
wild.
fear with peptides as a whole is the generalized mechanism, right? So when we look at
Mm,
endocrine ligands, like sex hormones, they're extremely well regulated. and they don't have this weird proliferated G-coupled effect that occurs in the immune system. Peptides often can involve unregulated proliferation, you know? So
Mm,
my only fear is that there
okay.
is not as much risk outside of maybe acute sudden cardiac arrest potentially with extreme oral steroids, caffeine, and ephedrine. Whereas with peptides, you very well could be setting yourself up to have cancer 20, 30 years down the line. And
Yeah.
I made a video about BPC almost 10 years ago now, where I was like,
Wow.
hey, using this like Advil could potentially do this one day to you. It doesn't mean it'll happen today, just like cigarettes, right? And I'm not saying they're as
Mhm.
bad as cigarettes, they're not, but it's like that we don't know, and the likelihood is actually somewhere in the middle, right? Some people
Yeah.
smoke cigarettes, never get emphysema. Some people smoke 3 cigars in their life and get emphysema,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It
I
it
mean,
ha
emphysema is very genetically informed to some extent. Like,
exactly,
you're gonna
right?
get
So
emphysema,
with
chronic
peptides,
bronchitis, like which one, you know?
you could just abuse peptides your whole life and be fine. Whereas
Mhm.
you could take 2 peptides for 2 years and end up with short or long-term problems, right? And
Mm,
I think like you to your point, that's the acute advancement outside of consumerism that needs to improve is like, are there any legitimate comorbidities, genetic criteria? Like GLP is getting better with that, right? To a degree with the medical system. Like, hey, if you have certain comorbidities, you actually aren't allowed to take this now.
yeah, it's
Whereas before,
contraindicated, you know what I mean?
yes.
But we don't have contraindications in this peptide world. Like, people aren't like, "You don't take this if this." Like, it's very general. Unfortunately, we don't have, like, certain genetic markers or anything. Although genetics, I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, like, the applicability of genetics, because we do have some great research on certain aspects of genetics that apply very, very well to, like, physiological, supplementation interventions, especially if you have, like, I don't know, something I'm experimenting with myself is I have a I basically have a pretty phenotypically schizotypal neurochemical system. And so, like, supplementing exogenous D-serine has been one of the most pronounced noticeable effects of any supplementation that I've ever utilized. And I only would have recognized that from understanding my DAOA uh, genetic S&P that's abnormal. Like, I never would have known that, never would have even been a supplementation option in my head. So there's things like that. I'm just wondering, like, when do you think that'll be able to be applied? Do you think it's relevant, or do you think research is like convoluted or anything like that?
No, I think it's totally relevant. I think it's only relevant to the information of the beholder. There's an
Mm.
obsession with lab analysis and blood stuff, but there's so much stuff outside of blood that you can test. Because in reality, a lab analysis, like I've said in the past, is like trying to screenshot the rims on a moving Ferrari, right? It's a small snippet of X lab markers at a moment in time, right? From the second you're in the womb, you're constantly changing chemical equation. So that's why let's look at something like lactate dehydrogenase and exercise. It's changing every minute, right? So lab analysis is fantastic, but is largely predicated on the context. I think we need a cohort of testing to make things functional. So I
Okay.
think gene testing is actually extremely valuable. I have three athletes that come to mind that were very, very well, like legit athletes at varying age groups that were extremely impacted by an MTHFR gene.
Mhm.
This is the most common one, which is
This
why
is
I
a
bring it
big
up.
one.
Yep.
Yeah.
2 out of 3 of them decided to do something about it. 1 out of 3 of them decided to ignore it. The one who got the most results was the one who, ironically or not ironically, focused on fixing it the most.
Okay.
The one who was in the middle was only in the middle and, like, kinda did, kinda didn't. And the one who ignored it actually has made, essentially no progress since the diagnosis several years ago, right? So it's not saying that MTHFR is the only thing that matters, but it's like the law of specificity, like you said. You could have taken 10 different things, but, like a right-handed serine molecule was all you needed, you know?
Yes.
And I think like the right tool for the right job can be really easy with certain polymorphisms being identified or anything like that. Whether
Yeah.
it's, a PGC alpha, ApoE gene, like the
Mhm.
epsilon 4 category. Like, there's really cool stuff out there that you can readily test for and be like, oh shit, like this is this matters to me or
Yeah.
not, you know?
Yeah. It's just I think a lot of it, is kind of bottlenecked by the development and a lot of these are predicated on public research databases. So we definitely need to continue to be able to study these polymorphisms. But even if the polymorphisms are identified, it requires a specific intervention. And so then another thing is trying to find that intervention that fits that specific polymorphism, understanding the additional context of that person's genome.
About the specificity of stuff is, to kind of be pro peptide on this part of the argument, is where peptides come in. Peptides are incredibly specific. Taking,
Yes.
a cortisol replacement, thyroid or testosterone, HRT stuff is non-specific. They're like kitchen sink hormones, you know?
Hmm.
But I think where people miss it is or over the counter supplements. A lot of them, like obviously not including herbs, vitamins and minerals are a lot more specific than people think they are, especially if you control for like how and what form and delivery method you get certain
Hmm.
things,
Like
right?
zinc
So I think
carnosine versus zinc, like that kind
very
of
well
stuff.
said.
Or
Exactly that. And I think
yeah,
that's where it's easy sometimes too. I had someone with familial migraines that at the time, this was like 6 or 7 years ago, I didn't have the opportunity to do magnesium testing outside of lab, which
the
blood
blood
magnesium testing
levels.
doesn't really
Yeah,
matter there. Like, right?
yeah.
It could be anywhere. So I was like, look, there is a polymorphism we can't test for related to women, familial migraine stuff, if you will. I was like, take a high dose of magnesium threonate, have your mother and grandma do it as well. And there's a small percentage chance you guys just all share it. Worst case scenario, it just doesn't work and you could throw out the
Yeah.
magnesium. And I remember a couple weeks later, she reached out and she said, me, my mom, and my grandma, all of our migraines disappeared. Right.
Beautiful.
Um, Small
Beautiful.
percentage chance of likelihood, but it's kind of like, I'm not a gambler, but it's like gambling, right? It's like, hey, there's a 3% chance I pull this off. Like, sweet, right? So
Yeah. Play
3%
with
chance.
your best edge.
Yeah,
And if the rewards make sense for the sacrifice, like you make the bet. You know what I mean?
a hundred
Um,
percent.
there's not really a real trade-off there to, the $20 of
Mhm.
magnesium spent to try to, cure this debilitating thing. It's makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that layering is important, right? Because, like, it could be so easy to overcomplicate things oftentimes. Like today, like the prescription today is if you want to improve longevity, don't worry about food or anything else. Take this peptide stack at a super high dose for 1 to 3 weeks, and don't worry about the $900 you owe me. I promise you'll be better off. And then part of the problem is we have algorithmic scores, whether it's insulin resistance scoring having to do with CRP and fasted insulin, or like the Bohr's related age score, we're creating algorithms to predict something that is not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio. Like, how
Okay.
does fasted insulin and a CRP and a lab analysis tell you an actual insulin resistance, right? It's a great tool. It's cool that it has a correlation over time, but that's not actually defining this, right? So at the
Yeah.
beginning, I said, if you want to get younger, you have to be below the area under the curve for as long as possible. Meaning, if you were in the bottom 10% of aging for a week, that doesn't matter. You're better off being in the 40th percentile for 10 years. And I
Mhm.
think that's where that really comes into play.
Yeah, yeah, it seems like just like with investing in terms of
Yes,
like
well said.
yeah, in terms of taking, a ton of risk on this like potentially super high yield biotech stock versus an index fund, you're going to make this certain percentage and historically we have so much more data to predict that, you know what I mean? I convoluted that, but
Warren Buffett said, "You're sitting under the shade of a tree today that was planted by somebody long ago." And I think that reigns true in sports biology as well as day-to-day life. Everyone, like I said earlier, timelines and impulse. Everyone's like, I had a fart come out sideways. What peptide do I take to make sure that never happens to me again? Instead of trying to play it out over time.
Yeah, yeah. I do before like we run out of time, I definitely want to talk about the pathophysiology of autism. Sorry I got a little distracted on the other topics. That was so interesting. But I know a lot of the work you do, especially with your nonprofit, centered around autism and you have a very large knowledge base there. So really interested, or even if pathophysiology is the right word, or like neurobiology, like what is this developmental phenotype of autism? Like, what are the deviations, I guess, in terms of like synaptic pruning, that kind of stuff? Like, fundamental level, like, what is autism?
So autism, it's got it in the name. It's obviously a spectrum or a gradient, right? So
Yes.
one of the primary things we see is BDNF responsiveness.
Okay.
Oftentimes, we may see an oversecretion, normal levels, or under secretions, right? But I think that's like where I personally am at the Super Brain Collective, that we'll call that our layer one. It's not something you could always test, but you can see it in real life relative to the stickiness of what someone does with a novel imposed learning stimuli,
Okay.
right? For example, if someone on the spectrum plays a video game once, and after playing it once, they're like, I remember everything and I already got all this, right? You could probably make an inference. Whereas if it takes repeated exposure to create learning based change, you can make another inference, right?
Okay.
I think the next thing to look at is we have a cohort of transcription factors, including GFAP and several others. RELN's another one, which is literally just Relin in real life. It's funny that that one only has a one-letter difference. It's RELN as a transcription factor, and as a full molecule, it's Relin, RELIN. I just thought that was funny. So like some names are crazy, right? Like Jack is Janus kinase. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
there's
yeah, for
really
sure.
weird names for stuff out there. There's some really logical names.
Yes.
But that being said, it's important to recognize, in my opinion, once we get over, we'll call it the stickiness and learning layer due to transcription related factors. The next thing that I largely focus on is visuomotor function and the arcuate fasciculus, in fact.
Okay.
Because I think when we try to do something general, we need to start categorical, right? So I think
Okay.
epigenetics and transcription factors are great, but we don't have that as access to everybody yet. What we do have access to in autism is the alignment of speech communication, the limbic system, and the frontal cortex.
Okay.
That's mediated by the arcuate fasciculus. And what we see is we need hemodynamic and electrical matching for things to come out right. Kind of funny enough, you did a good job of, whether you knew it or not, tying this to beginning. If you're speaking in front of 10,000 people, whether you have autism or not, why would going faster probably be a bad thing, right? Because you're going to have a frontal cortex going full speed, and odds are you probably don't have a Wernicke Broca's area that can go that fast.
Yeah.
So the arcuate
Yeah.
fasciculus is going to be connecting wires in the incorrect place. So when we, especially in the autism world, our goal is functionality and quality of life. So at the Superbrain Collective, when we focus on the arcuate fasciculus, we're simply trying to match the speed of cognition with the speed of communication. And same for
I
skills.
see.
Cognitive
Okay.
skills aligned with communication. Because it doesn't seem that different when you just say it like that, but there's camps, right? Like there's the linguistic language model, where the notion overarchingly is as long as you fix speech, everything will be fine. Right. And then there's opposite. There's as long as I can get this kid to read and do math problems, everything will be fine. And what
Yeah.
we're saying is kind of like what I said at the beginning in intersections is I think it's the balance of those that makes someone fine.
Very,
Because
very fascinating. Makes
right?
so
We
much
see
sense.
low functioning and high functioning autism oftentimes have the same real life side effects: isolation,
Yeah.
inability to communicate ideas. And it's the same problem. One just has a different alignment than the other, but super high functioning, maybe to the point of savant, we see extreme frontal cortex. And in fact,
Okay.
workability and metabolism. But to quickly change gears, in all autism spectrum disorder cases, we have delayed enlarging and frontal cortex volume accumulation as
Okay.
childhood begins, but it actually extends well past frontal cortex volume peaking in the normal typical person. Nearly everyone with ASD, their frontal cortex volume peaks between 29 and 33, whereas
Fascinating.
several years earlier, like 25 to 27, in normal typical. So I
Even for
think,
women?
yes, yes, this is
Interesting.
across all genders.
Very interesting. Okay.
Um,
Very, very
which
interesting.
is really interesting there because what we're starting, what we now see when I said the relationship between the two is focusing on communicating and sensory stuff early on needs to transition to cognitive skills later. Because if you're trying to do cognitive skills in a 7-year-old that has not developed their frontal cortex to the expected level of a 7-year-old, it's obviously not going to work. And that's where
Yeah.
special needs classes developed. But I think where a lot of things fall short is kind of like we said about peptides, recognizing that transition point and saying, okay, this skill will now only get better relative to the other skills. I don't think people need to know Le Chatelier's principles, the 3 laws of it mainly by heart, but I think just understanding that your rate limiting factor has a relationship with the yield, or your weakest link has a relationship with the end outcome is really important. And I think that reigns true in autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, fascinating. So what is the main differentiating factor practically in terms of the spectrum, like high functioning versus low functioning? From my preliminary research, obviously I don't have nearly the understanding that you do. I kind of have viewed it as like degree of neuroinflammation, but wasn't sure if that has any validity in reality.
No, no. So I think what's important, first off, with research is meant to disprove falsehoods. Research was never once meant to make a truth real. Right?
Mm,
That's for the
hmm.
board that not that there's a real board, but it's like the smartest people in any given field determining something goes through hypothesis, theory, law. That's where we discern truth.
Hmm.
Research, it happens before that. It's not a hypothesis until we've done enough research to say it's not true. But research is that step, disproving falsehoods. So all research is meant to say, hey, this is not stupid. This happens. But it's not
Yeah.
saying it's true. It's just saying it's not
Yes.
false.
Yes. Yes.
So, second point there is, are we looking at momentary physiology, or are we looking at cause relationship physiology? What I've
Mm,
seen is, and this is my opinion now, right? And obviously, the opinion I can speak on behalf of the board at Superbrain Collective. Neuroinflammation is a momentary physiology problem,
okay.
right? We
Yes.
can, this is like a funny joke, funny, not funny. Me and Mark Bell always do, like, send audio messages like this. Um, a super dose of KPV can kill a geriatric person. Why? Because low diastolic blood pressure is the number one indicator of mortality in the geriatric population. They have naturally loose vessels. If I knocked out all the nuclear factor KB in your body, you'd probably have a pulmonary embolism, right? And I
Yeah.
think, that, like, again, like, funny, not funny joke.
Yeah.
Um, but my point being, we need to recognize how we got here and look under the hood. Kind of like you said earlier, does this individual have neuroinflammation to the point that it's a fire, if you will? Like, we cannot determine proper cognitive function because of the degree of inflammation in the gut, blood, or neurological system? Or am I just looking for a problem
Mm.
and blaming it on that? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the distinction there
Okay.
is, what we've found is that when you correct for neuroinflammation not being an impediment in an individual, what we've seen in autism spectrum disorder is it's just a slightly different mode of teaching, but learning still happens. And
Okay.
what we've seen is neuroinflammation can inhibit that, but if it's incorrect or overwhelming, when,
Okay.
you know, it's corrected for, whether it's as simple as kefir and diet or however you
Yeah. I
attack
was
it.
going to ask about the gut
Yep.
relationship as well. I've heard you speak of that.
Yeah. Whenever you correct for it, however way, then it does fall on to, like I said, how you're teaching and progressing.
Okay, okay. I see what you're saying, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. But the Superbrain Collective is predominantly centered around, like you said, the I guess I don't know how to explain it. I'm trying to, like, rephrase, like, the broad a s a focus on, like, something singular but broadly affecting other, like, learning and such from, like, a fundamental way. Wow, I
No,
butchered
really
that.
well said. Our thing's awareness, right? We think
Yeah.
knowledge is power, and that if you're aware of something, and we believe in the practitioners and families of the community, that if you're aware of something, you'll probably do better because of it. So, for example, to a family where it's like, man, like Jimmy must be allergic to cheese or something. Because every time we have pizza, he gets a bad tummy and then he absolutely flips out behaviorally,
Mm.
rather than looking at it as Jimmy does not have the immune system dollars left over to handle a pizza. So when he eats pizza, we get neuroinflammation acting up and causing problems. But then
Oh,
5 days
yeah.
later, the pizza's out of the system and Jimmy's fine, right?
Wow,
And that's
yeah.
where the Super Brain Collective comes in. It's awareness. It was never the
Wow.
pizza's fault, right?
Wow,
And then
yeah.
same for practitioners, right? I think there's a lot of continuing education for practitioners out there. Same in the wellness field where it's only a one cause thing. It's like, if you happen to run across this exact scenario with this exact thing, here's what you do. And that might only occur, like I
Like this
said, one out of,
algorithmic, do
yes,
this, then this. Yeah.
right? And that's not as valuable as giving a practitioner tools. Like our big thing is research shouldn't die on the paper. So to families, we do awareness about what autism is in real life. But to practitioners, we do awareness about what science says. Because there's a huge, like even in peptides, there's a huge drop off. And in the neurodivergent community, it's too slow. For example, speak and write and speech to communication methods for lower functioning individuals is only becoming popular now, but that was cooking up in the research world a decade ago. And we want to decrease that lag time.
Wow. I see. So the acceleration of the inherently slow application of science. It's very, very incredible. I absolutely love that. Absolutely love that. Um, my father works with autistic children. He's a school psych, and he's running the autism program. And so I'm really excited to share this with him. He doesn't have time to read research day to day. He really doesn't. He's a busy teacher, but it's so important to be able to apply and understand those things. And just to kind of wrap things up, I just want to pose an additional question. Have there been any new studies in the last few years that have changed your mind about something important?
Hmm. You know, I can only think of this one at the moment, but I did somewhat of a deep dive on hesperidin not too long ago. The
Hesperigan, the mold,
No,
or
no, no.
is this a
I'm gonna
mold? I
say
have no idea. I just guessed.
Spiridon. No. Well, Hesperides, I believe, is the Greek god of health, and they
Oh,
just
okay.
named like this herb Hesperidin. It's
Okay.
also found in like super small amounts in some citrus fruits, and stuff like that. But there's an
Okay.
herb that they specifically call it. It's our Citrus arnantum is the best source of Hesperidin.
Okay.
In fact, a specific molecule coming from an herb, a botanical extract, right? And what I saw, and I think I even posted about it, which is extremely rare for me. Um, but what I saw was a lot of what we're looking at in terms of neurological disease doesn't have to be a one supplement for a one trigger scenario. Hesperidin does a great job of reducing caspase 3 and 9
Okay.
while also touching PGC alpha and while also touching the ability to improve acute oxidative phosphorylation. You know,
Okay.
three distinctly different supplement categories that can be found in, a molecule or two. So I think that was kind of what I saw in that it's not that we need a cohort, is that we need a more accurate angle and leverage point in supplementation protocols nowadays. I think it's
Mm,
far too getting into the coolest, newest, most powerful. Like I feel indifferent about dihexa, right? Like, it
yeah.
looks really cool in certain claims, but it's really, really strong. And we know things far weaker than that work really well. So that should make us question, what does something significantly stronger than that potentially pose? And I think whenever you're messing with learning, you're taking on a bigger responsibility than when you're messing with actin and myosin, right? Muscles
Mhm.
are relatively dumb,
Yes.
not in a
Yes,
bad
yes,
way.
yes.
They're electrically active rubber, essentially, right?
Yeah.
It's really the myonuclear domains that do information, but,
Mhm.
myofilaments and spindles themselves are relatively dumb by comparison, right? Whereas when we learn something through long-term potentiation and change our brain, that's a much more, robust, here to stay, and important adaptation in day-to-day life.
Yeah. Wonderful. Very wonderful and very fascinating too. I'm gonna have to do more research. I have no idea.
All good, all good.
Honestly.
Yeah, it's citrus arenauntum. It's a really, really cool
Okay.
plant.
Okay, absolutely fascinating. So I know that you said that you're hard to find, but if people want to find you, where might they be able to?
So, funny enough, I've been making a career change the last 2 or 3 years. And whenever I do my business consultations with people, one of the initial questions I ask them is that, would you want to serve a million people doing the same thing? Would you want to serve 10 to 20 people? Or would you want to serve a lot of different demographics in different vectors? And I chose the last one personally, right?
Mm.
I didn't feel the right security and lifestyle like balance I wanted serving just, 5 to 10 extremely high level athletes, right? I have a couple I still keep in touch with, and I have a couple retainers. Like I love sports to a fault. That'll never disappear. Um, but that wasn't the lifestyle I wanted,
That makes
nor
sense.
was serving like a million people with just one business in that route. So what I decided to do to hit all my personal checkpoints, because I don't like you can like whatever you like. I don't care. I think it's a plight for just doing what matters to you the most. I thought my best life and public interaction standpoint was in starting a couple of different businesses with the IP I've accrued over the years, right? So I've developed several patents. I'll talk about three today to kind of end on, because at the end of the day, unless you email me and like I have the time and kind of convince me to do something like a consult,
You're not
it's
in
not.
that world anymore, basically.
Yeah, it's not really that type of thing, and it's not
Yeah.
on purpose. I'm happier, and I think I can help more people this way.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
by the time this episode comes out, the Bio Learners Institute will be live. This
Okay.
is a online exercise science school. So it's cool in that it's decentralized education. It's not just like because I don't think one person teaching one course is true academia. I think you're
Mhm,
learning someone's methods, but you're
mhm.
not learning the material quite the same way. Right. And I did a pilot course to prep this. But what I did here was I took exercise science as a major as a whole and split it into 4 domains based on how you would apply and practice exercise science. Brought on 4 faculty members to create over the next 2 years 8 courses within each of those 4 domains, a total 32 courses a student can take to learn all about exercise science.
That's
And
awesome.
yes, thank you.
Yeah,
We're
that's so
charging a weekly
awesome.
subscription fee, and that's like the goal there is like unbiased academic level education and our things like radical clarity and that like schools don't tell you, and I went to school, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but schools don't tell you how much to study and what you'll be able to do with it when you're done.
Mhm.
And I thought that ambiguity made my life a lot harder personally in exercise science. Like I got screwed on a lot of big sports deals because I just like was a smart guy that had no idea what I was doing, And
Mm.
it's not a knock on the college I went to, it's just the nature of the beast. So
Yeah, yeah.
our goal is to be radically clear in telling students, hey, when you finish this 101 course, here's what we want you to be able to do. Here's the
Beautiful.
exact amount of time we recommend you study and here's the exact mode we think you should grow with the course you're on. So that's
Beautiful.
one really cool thing we're doing. The Superbrain Collective's obviously already live, and we have an exercise online remote program that's one-on-one, as well as a membership site for families. And we offer continuing education lectures for practitioners, schools, and all that stuff. And lastly, I'm opening up a novel technology company that involves some really cool stuff in the pulse oximetry, in the
Okay.
software as a service world, and in the we'll call it global wellness scalability world.
Okay.
So it's really cool in the sense that we all believe fitness and wellness is here to stay, of course. But I think most people's businesses are still a product of like kick the tires and see if the car runs.
Mhm.
Whereas if you open a supermarket or a clothing store, even if you're not Nordstrom or a big brand, there's a bona fide playbook of what you need to do to make ends meet, right? If you are in the women's department and you're not, I'm making this up. I don't know how women's clothes work, but you're not hitting these KPIs, the odds of you making enough money are low, right?
Okay. Yeah, I
And
see what you're
fitness
saying.
doesn't really have those, right? Fitness is just like, oh shit, I hope I help my clients out enough and get new ones, right? Especially in terms of gyms, wellness clinics, and physical massage
It's hard to
therapies.
quantify.
Yeah. So my team and I have spent the last 2 years creating a software hardware combination and a
Ooh,
KPI platform that does all of this at one touch with less than answering 2 or 3 questions involved at all. So it's
incredible.
extremely automated and really cool. I think health management relies in the coach, practitioner, and personal trainer's hands.
Okay.
What we're doing is, and what we're serving is the business. Because,
Oh,
like what
okay,
I
I
said,
see.
I made a bunch of business mistakes. I was great at my job. I just got screwed because I didn't know what I was doing as a business. Right. And that's our
Oh, okay.
angle
That
here.
makes more sense, I'm sorry.
Right.
Now I
Go,
understand.
go
Very
train
cool.
people and do your thing. We're going to tell you your return on investment for equipment, how you should market to your demographics and categorize the culture in your gym, and the success based on goal of your gym, personal training, or clients. So it might be like,
Oh.
wow, Lily, you have a 96% success for fat loss, but when people have injuries, you're only at 78, right?
Wow,
For example.
yes. Wow, I'm thoroughly impressed and I'm very excited to hear more about that. I mean, everything that you're saying is so incredible. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's just knowing what you want to do, right? Like I just knew that the 10 or the million approach, I would have broken down. And I knew
Mhm.
this was the avenue I had to traverse for myself and to help people the best I can.
Yeah, and it helps people on a much broader scale. I mean, far broader scale. Alrighty, then we can go ahead and wrap this up. That was incredible. Do you have anything else? Just want to make sure.
No, I think we had a fun hot take, I guess, like to end that's unrelated is like
Okay,
I
awesome.
recently I said this to my wife. I don't believe cheese should be on cold deli sandwiches.
Why
Um,
not?
I don't know. I just feel like if your bread, meat, vegetables, and like stuff on top is good enough, I feel like you don't need it.
Oh, but cheese is like always the cherry on top. You gotta put cheese on everything.
I'm not saying for like paninis and hot sandwiches. This is just a random hot take I have. I just like the cold deli sandwich. I feel like you don't need cheese.
Yeah, I guess like the textural component isn't
Ah, you
isn't
can argue with
optimal.
me. I don't care. This is how I feel.
Awesome hot take.
Yeah.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much. It's my mind has been spinning this whole time, like processing and understanding everything that you're saying. I'm so excited. I'm gonna sit in silence for probably about like a half hour and like think about everything that you said because that's what I need. And like, but so excited. Thank you so much for being on here. I'm
My
excited to
pleasure.
release this. But
Yep.
it was a pleasure to meet you. Bye bye.
Likewise. Have a good one.
You too.